And now, in the darkest hours of the night,
ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Collins.
You ready?
Chad Miles.
Let's go! Yeah! For those of you that want to know what we're all about, it's like this, y'all.
The new Theater of the Mind. The Bruce Collins Show. With the Baron of Broadcasting.
It took me years to learn what I know, too.
Yeah, but for you, Bruce, your knowledge was gleaned from the letters on the side of building blocks.
True. Welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show. We're very glad to have you join us. Tonight, we talk about the unseen realm with the author of the book, The Unseen Realm, Mike Heiser. The Bruce Collins Show airs every Thursday night at 10 p.m. on WWPR 1490 AM. You can also catch the show on Fridays at 10 p.m. Eastern Time online at ipbn-fm.com. That's ipbn-fm.com. Please tell your friends about the Bruce Collins Show, and you can join us on Facebook at the Bruce Collins Show page. We also have a Bruce Collins Show website, brand new. Again, a Bruce Collins Show website, thebrucecollinsshow.com, where you can get all the shows and a whole lot more, including a blog. Now, tell your friends about the Bruce Collins Show. Don't keep it to yourself. Let this news out. Let it go viral. You can also contact us. You can email us at bruce_collins_show@AOL.com. Drop us a line. Let us know how you're doing. The Bruce Collins Show also has a YouTube channel. Visit YouTube, search for the Bruce Collins Show channel, subscribe, and catch all the latest shows on YouTube. And now tonight, we're going to take a peek. We're going to peel back the curtain and take a look at the unseen realm with author Michael Heiser. He's been on this program in years past, and he's got a lot more to say in a moment. I'm honored and pleased to welcome back Michael Heiser. I haven't interviewed Michael for years and years. I don't know how many years, but I know it's been quite a few. Michael Heiser is a scholar in the fields of biblical studies and the ancient Near East, and he's a scholar in residence at Faith Life, the makers of Logos Bible software. Michael has an M.A. in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania, and he has an M.A. in Hebrew studies and a Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of many books, but his latest book is The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. Check this book out, The Unseen Realm. Of course, all of Michael's books are available on Amazon.com, so you can go on there tonight. Check them out. You can get an e-book, a Kindle book for The Unseen Realm, or a hard copy. And you can learn more about Dr. Heiser and his writings at DRMSH. So obviously that stands for Dr. Michael S. Heiser, but DRMSH.com. Again, that's DRMSH.com. Michael Heiser, I should say, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Bruce.
Well, it's great to have you on. Now, the subtitle of your book, The Unseen Realm, is Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. In what way or in what ways has this worldview been lost?
Yeah, thanks for noticing that, by the way. I think it's been lost in a number of ways and for a number of reasons. And I'm not going to, do some conspiracy, spiel here. I think that the reasons are pretty normal. And that is, just generally, I mean, we are modern people. We are products of, historians would tell us we're products of the Enlightenment. We're products of the scientific worldview. We are from a time and a place that is quite far removed from the biblical period. And, lots of Christians, lots of Bible readers, those interested in the Bible, like to talk about the context for the Bible, interpreting it in context like you'd want anything else to be taken in context. Mm-hmm. And they don't seem to realize that, we're 2 millennia on a good day. We're 2 millennia removed from the worldview and the frame of reference, just the whole intellectual, cultural frame of reference from the people who wrote the Bible. And the people who wrote the Bible were, guess what, writing it for people, in their own time and place. I mean, there's an immediate occasion for every book in the Bible, and it's not addressed or written to anybody in the modern world. So we are outsiders when it comes to the communication that the biblical writers, the things they're trying to convey, but just because of that reason. So I think that's one of the fundamental reasons. And a lot of the way we understand the Bible is mediated to us by our own Christian traditions, our Judeo-Christian traditions, and by definition, all of them are centuries or millennia removed from the original biblical context. Even the early church fathers were, really a millennium removed from the Old Testament, less so in the New Testament. It's only a few centuries there. Most of them couldn't even read Hebrew. I can only think of maybe 3 or 4 that could read Hebrew. And so you have these deep disconnects, time and place, language, just the whole, frame of reference, what scholars would call the cognitive frame of reference. We don't have any of that. And one of the big parts of that worldview, that frame of reference, was a predisposition to a supernaturalistic worldview. And that's why there are a lot of passages in the Bible that we think are kind of strange or kind of weird. And to an ancient person, they wouldn't have been strange or weird at all, because their worldview, the place that they sort of start from in terms of writing and reading, was not the Enlightenment. It's not the scientific worldview. It's something altogether different. And so we have really drifted quite far from that.
And one of the criticisms of your book I found on Amazon was written in this way. It's the following. I'm not even paraphrasing. I actually cut and paste. It said, this person wrote, "The whole thing kicks off by describing God ruling and reigning with lesser gods, and how we are meant to reign with them. Even if that is so, our attention is to be set on God and Him alone, and not on His divine counsel. This book so far goes to great lengths to draw attention to these lesser gods, and I find no biblical purpose for doing so. Just because there are Semitic ancient beliefs does not make them right." That is what he meant to write. "And my feeling is that this is all wrong, and the further I read, the more certain I became that this is a subject that has no place in our studies." Let's say that person was here tonight. If you could talk to this person, how would you respond? And then also after that, how much weight should a Christian give to extra biblical sources?
Yeah, I would respond by wondering if they read the whole book, because the word "so far" in those comments, I think, is telling. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is one of the 2 people who gave it 1 star.
I think so.
Of the 170 some reviews that, almost 90% have given it 5. So I would encourage the person, hey, read the whole book, because your attention is going to be drawn to the plan of God. This whole thing about the counsel, it's a very normal question. What does God need with a counsel? Why would we bother with this language? Well, God doesn't need a counsel. He doesn't need you either. Mm-hmm. He doesn't need us. But God, for some reason, likes to create intelligent beings that he allows to participate with him in governing his world and enjoying his world. And it's no different in the spiritual realm, and that's why we have talk of a heavenly host and a council. And there are some very clear passages, 1 Kings 22, Daniel 4, Daniel 7, where there are council meetings, and they participate with God in the governing, of what he wants to do in carrying out his decrees. 1 Kings 22, God has decided it's time for Ahab to die, but he allows the spirit beings, the members of his heavenly host there, to decide how to carry that decree out. How is Ahab going to go up and die? In Daniel 4, we have Nebuchadnezzar's insanity, that God has said, hey, this is what's going to happen to you. But the watcher, the Holy One giving the message, actually refers to the decree as the decree of the watchers, plural. But he also describes it as the decree of the Most High. So there's this symbiotic relationship. So I would say to the person, A, try reading the whole book. And B, try getting your theology from the text and not your tradition. I know it's unfamiliar, but this is what the text says. Okay, I don't write the Bible. I don't write the text. I just try to help people understand the text. So we all have to make a decision. I had to make it. Am I going to get what I believe the Bible says from the text itself or from what somebody else says about it? And I'm constantly directing people to the text. I'm constantly giving people breadcrumb trails to check up on me. Nothing in the book, this is the dirty little secret of the book, nothing in the book is unique to me. It is all the product of peer-reviewed biblical scholarship. And my job, my task, is trying to make that stuff decipherable to the normal person, somebody who's not in the guild, the PhD, club. If you're going to dismiss all of these parallels, then I never want to hear you talk about interpreting the Bible in context again, because you are violating that whole idea. See, the right context for interpreting the Bible isn't your context. It's not mine. It's not evangelicalism. It's not Catholicism. It's not Protestantism. It's not, anything. It's not the Puritans. It's not none of these things. They are all alien contexts when it comes to the Bible. The right context for interpreting the Bible is the one that produced the thing. And it's important because the biblical writers are responding many times to those ideas as, to correct them or to tweak them. Mm-hmm. Just because there's a divine counsel in, basically every ancient culture doesn't mean the one in the Israelite thinking is the same as the others. It's actually distinct in some really, really important ways. And that helps us understand what Israelites were thinking theologically as opposed to someone else. But if you just want to wipe that off the table, well, then go ahead. Pretend that the Bible was written by the Puritans or by Martin Luther or Calvin or somebody else. It just wasn't.
And again, we're speaking of Michael Heiser's new book, The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. Now, Michael, who are these beings that are known as lesser gods that are part of the divine council, and how do they operate?
Well, divine council is academies in part for the heavenly host. Again, the spiritual beings who are, inhabitants, if we want to use that term, inhabitants of the spiritual world. Of course, the Bible is very famous for having a spiritual world. There are spiritual realities, spiritual beings, whatnot. We're used to using terms like angels and demons, and they're certainly biblical terms, but they're not the only biblical terms. So, you get this idea of God having an entourage or a council or a heavenly host. Now, the council terminology is taken from Psalm 82 and Psalm 89 and a few other places. But they're spiritual beings. We brought up 1 Kings 22 a couple minutes ago. And that's a really good one because Micaiah the prophet says, I saw, the Lord, and he's having this vision that he's going to pronounce, Ahab's fate. And he says, I saw the Lord and standing next to him and seated next to him. We have the heavenly host, and the heavenly host in that passage are called spirits because the one spirit starts arguing with another spirit. A spirit steps forward and says, hey, I have an idea how to get rid of Ahab. So they're spirit beings. And again, most Bible readers are comfortable, with that terminology, but they don't realize, because it's either obscured in an English translation or they've been taught essentially not to look at certain things, But if you go to Psalm 82, the spirit beings, the sons of God, the sons of the Most High, are called Elohim. And that's really what freaks people out. When you show them, hey, the actual Hebrew text here has multiple Elohim running around in the spirit world. People get freaked out about that because we don't have a theological disconnect with what they're used to, but we do have a cultural disconnect. Here's what I mean. When we see the letters G, O, and D on a screen or on a piece of paper, we, because of who we are, again, with our Christian tradition, the way we've been taught to read the Bible, the way it's been filtered to us, when we see the letters G-O-D, our brain immediately assigns a specific set of unique attributes to that term, to G-O-D. So that when we see G-O-D, we think, oh, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence. And there can only be one being that has those attributes. So we get creeped out when you put an S on it. Well, the problem is that when the biblical writer used the term Elohim, he did not think of Elohim like we think of G-O-D. And you say, well, Mike, how do you know that? Well, we know that because if you actually just do a concordance search of Elohim, it actually gets used of half a dozen different things, only one of which is the God of Israel. And an Israelite, a biblical writer, would not view all those things as ontologically or in terms of their attributes equal. They wouldn't do that. My favorite example is 1 Samuel 28:13, where the deceased Samuel is allowed to speak to Saul. And the medium at Endor, when she's doing whatever she's doing to call up Samuel, says, I see an Elohim coming up out of the ground. That was very common in the Semitic world, hundreds of references in other literatures to calling deceased, the disembodied dead, Elohim. And you say, well, why? It's not because an Israelite writer would think, oh, my dead uncle is now on an attribute par with the God of Israel. No, that's absurd. It's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. No Israelite would think that. The point of Elohim is not attributes. Elohim is a term you would use to describe a being that is by nature disembodied and an inhabitant of the spirit world. And that's what the disembodied dead are. That's what the God of Israel is. That's what the gods of the nations are. That's what the demons are. Shadim, Deuteronomy 32:17. They're called Elohim. They're not the same as the God of Israel. So we don't have polytheism here. We don't have a disconnect. Elohim is just, there's lots of them because, hey, it's just a term you use for spiritual beings. In that realm, there is rank. There is hierarchy. There is differentiation. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh, because the biblical writers describe Yahweh. They say things about Yahweh that they never say about any other Elohim.
Now, one of the questions that your book, The Unseen Realm, answers is, why wasn't Eve surprised when the serpent spoke to her? Why do you think that was the case?
I think that was the case because Eden is the place of the divine counsel. In other words, Eden is the place where heaven and earth intersect, heaven and earth meet. And again, Christians are very familiar, with this kind of thinking. God has come to earth. He lives on earth. Well, but then they don't draw the obvious conclusion from other passages and from the Genesis story itself that where God is, his entourage is also. It's not just his house. It's the place from which he runs everything, okay? Mm-hmm. And that happens to be Eden at the beginning of the biblical story. And so, you get this feel from the conversations like in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve, sin, God has to deal with the effect of this, the fallout, if you pardon the pun. And the comment that is made is, now the man and woman have become like one of us. Okay, well, right there, that tells you that we need to be thinking plurality there, plural language. There's a group. Genesis 1, let us create humankind in our image. People say, well, that's the Trinity. Well, not only can we not restrict it to 3, but it wouldn't make any sense in Christian theology to have the Trinity there, because the typical orthodox doctrine of Trinitarianism says you have 3 persons that are co-eternal and co-equal in every way. So why would God have to announce his intention to beings that already knew it? because they're the same, they're co-eternal, God didn't pre-exist any of the other two. It just doesn't make any sense. It makes complete sense, though, if God is announcing his intention to a group, again, his heavenly entourage. So what I think is going on in Eden is Eve is very used to seeing God. Again, God is spoken of in anthropomorphic terms in Genesis 3. He's walking in the garden in the cool of the day. They're used to seeing God because God has to mediate his presence to them, and the typical way that happens in the Old Testament, many places, is God appears in human form. But she's also used to seeing, again, other spirit beings that are embodied. And again, people can read, the unseen realm, these chapters about this, but Nakash, the term that gets translated serpent, it can mean serpent if you take it as a noun, but Hanakash in Hebrew could also mean the one who dispenses divine knowledge, like in a divinatory kind of sense. It could be a verb. I hate to have the grammar spasm here, but it could be a participle, with an article, definite article on it. The one who dispenses divine knowledge. It could also be an adjective that's used as a noun. It could be the shining one. Again, and I go through the different options there, and I think, they could be a triple entendre. I don't think you have to really pick. But she's used to seeing divine beings in whatever appearance they are. And so when one of them comes up to her and says, "Hey, did God really say?" She's not like, "Whoa, what are you doing talking?" I mean, I think she's seen these guys come and go the whole time. Mm-hmm. And now she has a conversation, and this one has decided to deceive her because he wants to get rid of her and her husband.
So there's been a lot of discussion, Michael, in recent years about the Nephilim. In fact, there's been whole debates, even on Facebook. So how do you process...
Isn't that what Facebook is for?
Seems like it. I think it should be called Fight Book. Anyway.
Yeah, Fight Book. That's a great... I'll have to use that.
Yeah, how do you process the Genesis 6 account? What happened at that time?
Yeah, I actually spend the equivalent of 5 chapters on this in the book. I'll try to be brief here. There's no way that a non-supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6 makes any sense. And what I do, and what people will find in my book that they will not find in any other book, including commentaries on Genesis, is the original backstory, the original ancient context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Now, it's not in my book because I'm smarter than other people. It's in my book because I'm fortunate, again, to have written it in 2015, because in 2010, a cuneiform scholar, his name is Amar Anos, and I give people the reference in the book, decided I'm going to reevaluate, I'm going to recollate all of the Mesopotamian information about the flood, from the cuneiform tablets, with a specific eye toward what's going on in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And he has this wonderful article. You can access it actually from my website, drmsh.com. If you put in the last name ANNUS and Genesis 6, you'll find the article. It's available on the web. But what he shows is that every point of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, divine beings before the flood, cohabiting with humans, producing giant offspring that they're men, but they're more than men because they're also these spirit beings, and they're sinister and they get punished, and the original divine beings get sent to the underworld to never return. All these elements that you see in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 and other passages in the Bible that reflect back on Genesis 6, 1 through 4, every one of them is in Mesopotamian literature. And so what I'm doing in the book is I'm giving people all that information. You will never find it in a commentary. You will never find it in any other book because it was only written a few years ago. So that's to your benefit. But the reason I bring it up, the reason I do it in the book, is that look, if this was the context, and I explain why was Genesis 6, 1 through 4 written? Basically, it's a theological corrective to the Mesopotamian version of events. Again, the biblical writer is doing it for a specific point. Mm-hmm. But if this is the original context, it involves divine beings. Well, then interpretations like the Sethite view, well, the sons of God are just people, godly men from the line of Seth. They're just bunk. Okay, they're out of context. They are in violation of the original biblical context. So I take a supernatural view of Genesis 6. There are actually two possibilities. One is the direct, sexual cohabitation view. And I go through again why that can be argued, based on, biblical passages, biblical exegesis and whatnot. But the other option is the language might be euphemistic for divine intervention in a dark sense, akin to what happened with Abraham and Sarah. We're told that Sarah was enabled to have a child, by God. We're not told what God did, but there was some sort of divine intervention there, and that resulted in Israel, in Abraham having the child of promise, and then we get the nation of Israel. Well, the language of Genesis 6 might be trying to communicate the idea that other hostile, gods, other rival spiritual beings, may have done the same thing, again, to raise up specifically enemies to Israel, because that is how the giant clan bloodlines play out in the conquest narrative. So that's the short version, but I do not take a non-supernatural view of Genesis 6, 1 through 4.
Mm-hmm. As we know, angels have appeared as messengers. They've eaten with people. Mm-hmm. Is this flesh an illusion, do you think, or of some kind, or can they become like flesh, or do they have a flesh?
It's actually kind of an interesting question, because I just did an episode not too long ago on my podcast on 1 Corinthians 15. People could go look that up, nakedbiblepodcast.com, and look for the episode on the celestial body, the spiritual body that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. And, to make it quick here, that idea comes from, a number of Old Testament passages that Paul's talking about, and it's the body that Jesus had. So it would have been truly human. There are differences about it. It can be, apparently, from what the Gospels say, flesh that can be subsumed and I don't know if the right word is withdrawn, but essentially the limitations and properties of it aren't quite what ours are. It's an embodiment, but a different kind of embodiment. Mm-hmm. It's human flesh, human embodiment, but it also transcends human embodiment. Theologians like to use the phrase glorified body. Well, that's what it is. It's kind of a, it's not a useless phrase, but it's not a very descriptive one either. But, to go back to the question, if this is what you're dealing with, then Jesus, when he appeared again to the disciples, was not a mere illusion. They do, he does get handled. He does invite them, to, hey, stick your finger in the wounds in my hands, Mm-hmm. I mean, he does do things like this. And there are other episodes where it's not Jesus, but some other being, again, that it's very physical. I mean, you don't get tossed around and dragged into a room like, with Lot or with Jacob and say, oh, that was a pretty rough illusion. I mean, there's right. A corporeal thing going on here, but yet it transcends the normal, the normal human embodiment.
There's been in recent years a really popular theory about a holographic universe. Do you subscribe at all to that?
Well, I don't, because honestly I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. And I know, I'm not a physicist, and I know physicists, you get them both that kind of are enchanted by the idea, but then there's a lot of them that just poo-poo it as well. But to me, I would want to know what's generating the hologram, because if there's something generating the hologram, then I don't see why there couldn't be a very real universe. You follow what I mean?
Yes. Yes.
We're taking this hologram view to do what? Right. Just to say that nothing's real? Well, actually, there'd have to be something real to generate this. I mean, to me, it's kind of one of these, endless loop sort of things that doesn't really accomplish much.
Yeah.
But I'll let the physicists go back and forth with that one.
And there seems to be some popularity with that theory among Christians. Wouldn't that sort of disqualify the crucifixion, though, if that were real?
Well, it disqualifies all sorts of things, because the Christians who would buy into that, I think, are reading their Old Testament very poorly. And here's what I mean. Like, in the book I talk about the messianic profile, and part of that is the necessity of God becoming man incarnate. Mm-hmm. And this is something that a lot of Christians aren't really familiar with, because frankly, the Old Testament gets ignored in church most of the time.
Right.
But you have God come to his people, to Israel, and make covenants. There's a series of covenants. There's the Abrahamic covenant, there's the Sinai covenant, there's the Davidic covenant. Okay, all of these things work in tandem with each other, and they're all aimed at kick-starting Eden again, kick-starting the rule of God on earth again, where God can return to earth as, as a ruler, as the king, and live among his people and have everything sort of just go back to Eden and here, isn't this wonderful? But there's a big problem. God makes these covenants with people, and people fail consistently and regularly and invariably. And so the only way for God not to cheat at fulfilling these covenants is if he becomes a man and is born into that people, into specifically the Israelite nation, and even more specifically the line of David, and fulfills them himself. It's the only way when you can have the terms of the covenant, all the covenants met. God has to do it himself. That necessitates the incarnation. So not only is the crucifixion in trouble, if we have this holographic thing, every point of biblical theology is in trouble. The entire narrative of salvation history is in trouble. Again, but people don't seem to realize this because they're not connecting these dots in their mind. They're thinking about the 2 or 3 New Testament stories that they do know, because I'm not saying I don't want people to misunderstand. I'm not saying people who are interested in the Bible, Christians, are dumb. I think the problem goes to the heart of what goes on in church, and that is a leadership problem. I think overwhelmingly, the people who are pastoring churches, preaching on a given Sunday, regularly underestimate the interest and the ability of their people to digest content, serious content. Mm-hmm. And what they give them instead are little self-help platitudes and biographical sketches, and be nice to your kids and your wife week after week after week after week. Of course, they'll sprinkle the gospel in there, which most of the people there already know. I just think people are underestimated by what happens in church. And so one of the byproducts is very poor thinking theologically and very simplistic thinking, when it just doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. We're speaking this week with Dr. Michael Heiser. His website is drmsh.com. Again, that's drmsh.com. He's the author of many books, but his latest book is The Unseen Realm, Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. Now, Michael, when the Bible talks about a being like the Prince of Persia, how do you think these beings with geographical oversight perform duties, and what would these duties consist of? How does this system work?
Yeah, we're not given specifics, but we are given the general structures. For instance, this talk, which comes from the book of Daniel, specifically there in chapter 10, is, of course, inherited from what I call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, when God decides to disinherit the nations at Babel and assign them to lesser Elohim, to the sons of God, as a punishment. And again, ideally, if we take what Paul's, comments about this in Acts 17 seriously, this was supposed to be part of God's, program to, both punish, the nations and also, lead them back, to recognize Israel, Yahweh's portion in Deuteronomy 32:9 and the Messiah. But, that's the situation that developed. They become corrupt according to Psalm 82. Those are the Elohim that God is angry with. And we have a bad situation. So we're given the broad structures of it, and we are told in Daniel, going back to like Daniel 7, that these you have the beast terminology. You have, again, the angelic, if you want to use that term, terminology associated with nations. That there are these, divine beings associated with nations, and there's some sort of geopolitical relationship between, again, what goes on earth and what happens in heaven, because these nations are spoken of as a succession of empires. And so what happens in empires on a granular level, on a micro level, we're not really told specifically, what divine beings are doing with that. Mm-hmm. But we are told that they are behind what the empires are doing. And that's why in Daniel 7, these, supernatural creatures are the ones that get punished in relationship to the passing away of empires. So there's some relationship going on there between them and what happens on earth. And the Bible's very known for this as in heaven, so on earth kind of talk. Mm-hmm. That the spiritual world and the human world, the world of the embodied, are different worlds, but they are connected in terms of, what happens in one, has an effect on what happens on the other and vice versa. Right. So this is again the picture that we get. We get again this. There's an interest after the whole system sort of becomes corrupt. There's an interest in forestalling Yahweh's portion, Israel, Yahweh's people, from successfully reinvigorating the Edenic idea. In other words, there's resistance now to the return of Eden, to Yahweh's children inheriting the earth, to Yahweh's portion, again, being the domain of his kingship. And so you have world empires resisting this. And behind those world empires are rival gods that are hostile to Yahweh of Israel and to his people. And so you get this constant sense of spiritual antipathy being behind earthly antipathy. But we don't get a whole lot of, granular descriptions of that. In the New Testament, when Paul inherits this worldview from the Old Testament, this is, for instance, why Paul, he does use the word demons, 2 or 3 times. But most of the time when Paul talks about the powers of darkness, the spiritual powers of darkness, look at the terms he uses. Principalities, powers, dominions, thrones, rulers, authorities. What do they all have in common? They are all geographical dominion terms. And in Paul's thinking, what they're really about is distracting people from the gospel, distracting people from the kingdom of God, distracting people from how God views them and how God loves them, how this destiny that God wants to restore to the earth. And that can be anything from hostility to God's own people in violent terms to ridicule. If you look at how Paul talks about these beings. So again, we aren't given that much, but we are given this notion that there is a relationship. They drive the bus when it comes to what's going on here.
In your book, The Unseen Realm, and again we're speaking with Dr. Michael Heiser, you talk about who the glorious ones are that even angels dare not rebuke. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the term comes from Peter and Jude, and specifically, we have this odd passage where, there's this, dispute, the archangel Michael in the book of Jude, contending with the devil, disputing over the body of Moses, and he didn't presume that he had the authority or the right, or it was his place to, quote, pronounce a blasphemous judgment. Again, and specifically the referent to that, if you go back to Peter, and again, what's going on there is they don't want to blaspheme the glorious ones in Jude verse 8, and the reference in 2 Peter 2:10. But even Michael, who again has a high position, doesn't presume that he has the authority to blaspheme or revile the glorious ones. And he says even angels, again, in Peter he says even angels don't do this. Why? The false teachers that Peter's writing about, when they do this, they just don't know what they're doing. They essentially they better watch out, because even angels don't do this stuff. Mm-hmm. They don't talk like this. Now I think the celestial ones, frankly, I think this is a term for the high-ranking, enemy beings, the high-ranking sons of God. Now, this takes a little bit. Again, I'm going to try to summarize this from the book, but we're used to terms like angel. Okay, and we kind of conflate the terms angels, sons of God, whatnot, demons. We throw all these terms into one bucket because that's the way we're taught. Well, Elohim is a term, again, that is used of all spiritual beings. All spiritual beings are Elohim. Yahweh is one of them, but none are like him, so on and so forth. The term angel is actually a job description. It's not what a thing is, it's what a thing in the spiritual world does. He's a messenger. That's what malach in Hebrew, angelos in Greek means. Messenger. Takes messages. Sons of God is actually an authority term. Again, kind of a job description that goes back to the ancient Near Eastern idea that the leader, the king, would have an inner circle, would have a special group of trusted individuals that got the most important jobs, the most important posts in the administration. And they typically were family members. Okay, again, sons of God, sons of the king, well, they're the ones that get the big jobs. And that's the way that the language plays out in the spirit world. So I think the celestial ones are beings that outrank angels, which is why Peter says, man, the angels don't do this. I mean, are you kidding? The angels aren't going to talk about the celestial ones like this. And Michael, who is an archangel, he's a ruler over angels. Again, Michael, by virtue of the way he gets talked about, is probably of equivalent rank. In other words, he doesn't outrank them either. He's at least of the equivalent rank, and so he doesn't presume to have authority over them. Mm-hmm. Again, he's one of that group. That's why he says the Lord needs to rebuke you, not me. I'm not gonna do this.
Now, I have a question for you that could be deemed a softball. It's gonna hang up there, real slow, pass by the plate. Why do you think a lot of end times prognosticators end up using a giant eraser when they make bold claims about timetables? Why are they so inaccurate?
Because they are, I'll have to be honest with you, because they are naive and inept interpreters. Mm-hmm. Now, what I mean by that is, and I'm sort of famous or infamous for saying I don't like any of the eschatological positions, any of the end times views, because they all cheat. And I say that because it's true. Okay, I'm just gonna tell people the truth. They all cheat. They all look beautiful until you compare them to another system that exposes the weaknesses of the one you like. So what typically happens is these people they base a lot of their conclusions on the English Bible, the Bible in translation. They don't realize, or they don't care, and I'll be honest with you again, I think a lot of it is the latter category, because they want to gain a following and frankly, make some cash off what they're saying. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit cynical, I guess you can tell here. But I think that they either don't realize, or they don't care that there is so much about prophecy that is ambiguous in the Bible itself. All views will know, all the people who, sort of are the theologians behind these views and defend different views, they all know that these things are out there, these ambiguities. But they pick an interpretation, they pick a side on some point of ambiguity, and then they erect their system accordingly. So these date setters either ignore the fact that, if I made a different interpretive decision in a dozen different passages, or a dozen different places and different topics, if I made a different decision, I am just 180 degrees away from where I am right now. They either don't tell people that, or they don't know it. So they either don't want people to know, or they're inept. And, I don't know how it falls out, but that's why when they're led to making these predictions, they're operating only on the basis of this system they have reconstructed or bought into, and then they just sort of run with it. And we get the results that you just named. Let me give you an example. The whole reason why people talk traditionally, this isn't why I would talk about it this way, but the whole reason people talk about a future millennial kingdom is because they assume, or catch the word, they assume that the promise, the land promise given to Abraham back in Genesis 12 is still in effect. Hasn't been fulfilled yet. It still has to be fulfilled to the physical descendants of Abraham. Well, that's an assumption. Okay, you say, well, why do you put it that way, Mike? Well, I put it that way because let's set aside the fact that there are actually 3 different descriptions in the Old Testament of what the promised land is. Let's put that aside, because again, your prophecy experts, quote unquote, don't even know that. Okay, let's put that aside. Let's just say there's one description of the promised land. Well, guess what? If you look during the time of Solomon, basically all of that land was under Solomon's control. So is that fulfilled? Was that fulfilled then? Did they get the promised land then? Well, I don't think so. And someone else will say, well, yeah, I think they did. Okay. Did they sin it away when the exile happens and they go into idolatry? Because Deuteronomy and Leviticus are very clear. Leviticus 26, just read it, that the presence in the land is directly linked to not following other gods. Well, they actually did that. That's why they get sent into exile. So if you don't believe the land was fulfilled under the days of Solomon, did they sin the promise away? Because that's what Leviticus 26 says is going to happen. And if you don't like that, you go to Galatians 3, where Paul says, look, if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And Paul talks about not being, Israel isn't just physical. Israel is Israel, by faith. They follow the faith of Abraham. Those are the real Israelites. So is Paul redefining what it means to be a child of Abraham into something non-physical? And if he does, and he certainly does in Galatians 3, if he does, well, does that mean that the church, the Gentiles, also inherit the covenant promises? It sure sounds like that. Well, then what about the land? Is it the whole world? Because, hey, there's this Great Commission thing going on and inheriting all the nations, and Yahweh's supposed to reclaim the nations. And there are so many rabbit trails. And I'm only talking one topic. That's the land topic. There's a dozen other topics that have these little nooks and crannies and trajectories and ambiguities. I don't, how do we, the Bible doesn't have a handbook in the back that says, oh, the Abrahamic covenant should be parsed this way and not that way. It doesn't have any of that. Mm-hmm. So everybody guesses on these things, and then they erect a system, and there you go. But these prophecy prognosticators, I think they're either naive or inept. I guess we could throw in corrupt. They want a following. And so they land somewhere and tell people that they have the wisdom that nobody else does.
Now, Michael, here's another fun topic. I personally see no evidence of this today, but I know this is also a subject that comes up, and it's been the fodder of some really bad shortwave radio sometimes. But would you personally be shocked or not shocked if Nephilim were found on the earth today?
Do you mean like a skeleton or
something from an underground base?
Yeah, I don't buy into the modern Nephilim theories. Again, if you're taking the biblical text seriously, the last of the Rephaim line, which was of the Anakim, which are from the Nephilim, again, the last of those were Goliath and his brothers, and they're killed off. If you go with the Septuagint, you might be able to stretch that into the days of Jeremiah, but even then, I think it's sort of a looking back into Israel's history. Mm-hmm. Even if you go with that, there might be one straggling reference to the Anakim in Greek that shows up in Jeremiah that isn't in the traditional Masoretic text. But anyway, if you're taking the Bible seriously, the line is killed off. Mm-hmm. And there are reasons for that. Again, I talk about them in the book a little bit, why, what the point is for that. So I don't buy into this modern theory at all. So I would be shocked and amazed. And even if you did find one, okay, then it's probably the result of some genetic, fiddling. I mean, if I were a geneticist with lots of cash and an evil mind, I could probably do that. So in other words, the product isn't the result of some heavenly transgression like it was in Genesis 6. And I know people are going to say, well, that's what they were doing back in Genesis 6. Yeah, well, I don't know what the Hebrew word for DNA is. There is no such thing. So a culture that doesn't have a word, the Hebrew Bible doesn't have a word for brain. So a culture that doesn't know that the brain is actually the seat of the emotions as opposed to the kidneys and the heart and all this kind of stuff. Oh, they miss that, but somehow they're good at genetics. Okay, it's just absurd everywhere you look at it. So I don't think there's any point. I'd also be surprised, less surprised, but I'd still be surprised if we found a skeleton, that dated back, to the biblical period, let's say to the period of the conquest. And the reason for that is think about it. I mean, if you go back to
they've deteriorated, right?
What was that?
Most of the skeletons would have deteriorated.
They're gone. Yeah. They're gone. I mean, if you go back 1500 BC, which is 3,500 years ago, just do the math. There should be, millions of people would have lived in the Middle East during this 3,500 year span.
Yeah.
But we don't have their skeletons. If you actually look, and I have looked, I mean, the Israeli Antiquities Authority has a database of human skeletal remains. It's extraordinarily rare to find anything older than 1,000 BC, which is at least 500 years post Moses. Mm-hmm. So you're just not going to find anything. They didn't embalm. Okay, yeah. We find this stuff in Egypt because they embalmed. They didn't do that in Syria, Palestine, Canaan, Israel. They didn't do that. So to find anything like that would be just extraordinarily unlikely. Now I know some people listening to this, and they're not going to like this when I say it. Some people say, "Well, I saw on YouTube that there's a Professor Jonathan Tubb, from London, and he found two skeletons a female that were over 7 feet tall, and there's proof, Mike. There's proof." Well, first of all, I don't doubt that they were extremely tall people. Mm-hmm. The Nephilim, I don't doubt that. But guess what? I emailed Professor Tubb, okay, because I know why people say this. They say this based upon a comment that is in a particular Deuteronomy commentary by a professor that I knew because I went to the same grad school, and I know that this guy says, I got this quotation wrong. But rather than just say that in my book, I emailed Professor Tubb, and I said, hey, I heard this, I read this thing in the commentary. Are you still working on an excavation report about these skeletons? I'd love to see it. What can you tell me about them? And I have the email reproduced on the companion website to the book, moreunseenrealm.com. But I have the text of it in the actual book, unseenrealm.com. And Tubb says, you know what? We didn't find anything like that. Sorry to disappoint you, but we didn't find anything like that. And this is, I said this or that, and some, that so and so misunderstood it, which I already knew. To date, there hasn't been a single giant skeleton found from Canaan, from the biblical period. And again, I'm not expecting one just because of the reason you just said. They're all deteriorated. Nobody embalmed.
Now, Michael, in the closing moments, talk about your website. First of all, what can people find at drmsh.com?
Sure. drmsh.com is my homepage. It's the nerve center for everything I do. I maintain 3 blogs. I mean, I will blog about biblical stuff. That's the Naked Bible. I'll blog about crazy things people say about the ancient world. That's Paleobabble. And I will also blog about UFO stuff. That's UFO religion. So you can find all 3 blogs there.
How much of a geek are you? No, seriously, do you think you're a Star Wars expert? Well, take the hardest Star Wars quiz in the world and find out. Go to zippycheese.com and see how well you know the Star Wars movies. There's a quiz for the original trilogy, or, if you dare, take the quiz for the prequel trilogy. What's the name of the creature in the trash compactor in Episode 4? What was the name of the curator of the Jedi Archives in Episode 2? Go to zippycheese.com, take the quiz, and share with your friends. There's also a Marvel comic book quiz. Do you know obscure Marvel comic book characters? We'll find out today. That's zippycheese.com.
Thank you once again for joining us here on the Bruce Collins Show, where we broadcast every Thursday night at 10 p.m. right here at WWPR 1490 AM. Remember, God loves you. We do too. Don't give up.